A storm brewing. The morning sun filtered through the large glass windows of Clearwater International Airport, painting streaks of gold across the bustling terminal. Travelers shuffled through security lines, clutching passports and coffee cups, while announcements echoed overhead. Amid the chaos, Captain Sophie Langston strode confidently through the staff entrance. Her crisp navy blue uniform fit perfectly, and the golden wings on her chest glinted in the sunlight, signaling her hard-earned rank. Sophie wasn't just any pilot. She was a trailblazer, one of the youngest and most respected captains in her airline. Sophie loved flying. To her, it wasn't just a job. It was a calling. Her years of relentless training and dedication had made her one of the best in the business. But she knew that not everyone shared her passion or respect for her position. Today, she felt it in her gut. Something was off. She arrived at the crew briefing room, a spacious area lined with whiteboards and seating for the flight crew. She smiled warmly at her team as they exchanged greetings. "Morning, everyone," she said, her voice clear and authoritative. "Let's get started." Among the crew was First Officer Jack Mitchell, a senior co-pilot with years of experience under his belt. Jack was known for his precision in the cockpit, but not for his open-mindedness. Sophie had flown with him before, and while he had never been outright disrespectful, she could sense his skepticism. Jack came from a generation that hadn't fully embraced diversity in the cockpit, and he made little effort to hide his discomfort with female authority. As Sophie began the pre-flight briefing, Jack sat stiffly in his chair, arms crossed, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. Sophie noticed but continued undeterred. She covered the flight plan, weather conditions, and potential turbulence with her usual professionalism. When she asked for input, Jack's responses were curt and dismissive. Finally, as the meeting concluded, Sophie addressed the group with a smile. "Let's make this a smooth flight for everyone. See you all on board." The crew dispersed, but Jack lingered. As Sophie gathered her papers, he approached her, his expression tense. "I need to talk to you," he said flatly. Sophie looked up, her eyebrows raised. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Jack hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I'm not comfortable flying with you as captain." The word hung in the air like a bombshell. Sophie's heart skipped a beat, but her expression remained composed. "I see," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And why is that?" Jack shifted uncomfortably. "Look, it's nothing personal, but I don't think women belong in the captain's seat. It's just how I feel." For a moment, Sophie was speechless. She had faced subtle biases before, but this was blatant. She took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay professional. "Jack, I respect your opinion, but this is not up for debate. I am the captain of this flight, and I expect you to perform your duties as first officer." Jack's face flushed with frustration. "I don't think I can do that," he muttered. Before Sophie could respond, the door opened, and the flight manager, a tall man with a commanding presence, entered the room. He immediately sensed the tension. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. Jack turned to him, his voice rising. "I don't want to fly with her. I won't." The flight manager's expression hardened. "Captain Langston is your commanding officer. If you refuse to fly, you'll be removed from this flight and face disciplinary action. The choice is yours." Jack's face turned red as he realized the gravity of the situation. He muttered something under his breath and stormed out of the room, leaving Sophie and the flight manager in silence. "Are you all right, Captain?" the manager asked. Sophie nodded, though her chest felt tight. "I'm fine. Thank you for stepping in." The manager gave her a reassuring look. "You've earned your position, Sophie. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Sophie smiled faintly, but the encounter left a bitter taste in her mouth. She had worked tirelessly to reach this point in her career, and yet here she was, having to justify her right to do her job. As Sophie boarded the aircraft, she was greeted warmly by the cabin crew. She returned their smiles, masking her lingering frustration. The passengers were already settling into their seats, oblivious to the drama unfolding behind the scenes. In the cockpit, Sophie began her pre-flight checks, her hands moving deftly over the controls. A few minutes later, Jack entered, his demeanor cold and detached. He didn't say a word as he took his seat beside her. Sophie broke the silence. "I trust you'll do your job professionally." Jack didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Sophie pushed her emotions aside and focused on the task at hand. This wasn't about proving herself to Jack. It was about ensuring the safety of everyone on board. The engines roared to life, and the plane taxied to the runway. Sophie's voice came over the intercom, calm and reassuring. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Langston speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 227. We'll be taking off shortly, and our expected flight time is 4 hours. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey." As the plane lifted into the sky, Sophie felt a familiar sense of peace. Flying was her sanctuary, her escape from the challenges of the ground. But today, that peace was fleeting. She could feel Jack's hostility like a storm cloud hovering over the cockpit. She focused on the controls, her training kicking in. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the real turbulence hadn't even begun. The weight of the skies. The Boeing 737 cruised steadily at 35,000 feet, the hum of the engines a constant backdrop to the tense silence in the cockpit. Captain Sophie Langston kept her focus on the controls, her mind sharp despite the lingering discomfort from her earlier confrontation with First Officer Jack Mitchell. She had been in high-pressure situations before, but this felt different. The tension between them was palpable, a weight pressing down on the confined space of the cockpit. Jack sat stiffly in his seat, his arms crossed, staring out the window at the vast expanse of clouds. His silence wasn't passive. It was defiant. He hadn't said a word since takeoff, refusing to engage even in routine communication. Sophie knew she couldn't let his attitude compromise the safety of the flight, but she also couldn't force him to change. "First Officer Mitchell," Sophie said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm but firm. "I need your confirmation on fuel levels and navigation adjustments." Jack turned his head slightly, his expression cold. "Everything's fine," he said curtly, without making eye contact. Sophie sighed inwardly. This wasn't just unprofessional. It was reckless. Pilots relied on teamwork to ensure the safety of everyone on board, and Jack's refusal to cooperate put them all at risk. She decided to address it head-on. "Jack," she began, softening her tone slightly, "I understand you have reservations about me as your captain. But this isn't about personal feelings. It's about the job. The passengers are counting on us to work together." Jack's jaw tightened. "I don't have an issue with the job," he said through gritted teeth. "I just don't think you should be the one doing it." Sophie felt a surge of frustration, but kept her composure. "That's your opinion, and you're entitled to it. But right now, this aircraft is my responsibility, and I need your full cooperation. If you can't do that, then you're endangering everyone on board." Jack's eyes flashed with anger, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned back to the window, effectively ending the conversation. Sophie clenched her fists under the console, resisting the urge to say more. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, but Jack's blatant disrespect tested her limits. As the flight continued, Sophie immersed herself in the routine tasks of monitoring the aircraft systems, adjusting their course, and communicating with air traffic control. The weather ahead showed signs of turbulence, but nothing out of the ordinary. She prepared herself mentally for the challenges ahead, knowing that the skies were often as unpredictable as the people she worked with. The cabin crew moved through the aisles, serving drinks and snacks to the passengers. In the cockpit, the silence was broken only by the occasional beep of the instruments. Sophie glanced at Jack, who remained motionless, his body language radiating hostility. She decided to focus on what she could control. She adjusted their altitude slightly to avoid a patch of rough air, her hands steady on the controls. Outside the cockpit window, the clouds stretched endlessly, a reminder of the vastness and unpredictability of the world they navigated. 2 hours into the flight, the first signs of turbulence appeared. The plane began to shake slightly, a gentle rocking that was common at this altitude. Sophie monitored the situation closely, her eyes scanning the instruments for any signs of escalation. "This is Captain Langston," she announced over the intercom, her voice calm and reassuring. "We're experiencing a bit of turbulence, but there's no cause for concern. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened, and we'll have a smooth flight shortly." In the cabin, passengers murmured quietly, their unease tempered by Sophie's steady tone. The flight attendants moved quickly to secure loose items and reassure nervous travelers. Back in the cockpit, Sophie turned to Jack. "We'll need to adjust our altitude again to avoid this turbulence. I'll need your assistance with the navigation inputs." Jack didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his tone was clipped. "You've got it under control, Captain. I'm sure you don't need my help." Sophie stared at him, incredulous. "This isn't about what I need, Jack. It's about following protocol. If we don't work together, we're putting the passengers at risk." Jack met her gaze, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he grudgingly leaned forward and began inputting the coordinates Sophie had requested. But his movements were slow and deliberate, as if to emphasize his reluctance. Sophie bit back a retort and focused on guiding the plane through the turbulence. The turbulence grew worse, the gentle rocking intensifying into sharp jolts that rattled the cabin. Sophie tightened her grip on the controls, her training kicking in as she worked to stabilize the aircraft. The passengers' murmurs turned to gasps, and the flight attendants braced themselves against the aisles. "Jack," Sophie said sharply, "I need you to monitor the engines and call out any anomalies." Jack hesitated, his hands hovering over the controls. For a moment, Sophie thought he might refuse. But then the plane jolted violently, and a warning light flashed on the control panel. Jack's face paled as he finally began to engage, his fingers flying over the controls. "We've got an issue with the left engine," he reported, his voice tense. Sophie nodded, her mind racing. "Okay, let's work through the checklist. We'll stabilize the flight first, and then address the engine issue." As they worked together, Sophie felt a shift in Jack's demeanor. His arrogance and defiance were replaced by a nervous urgency. For the first time, he seemed to realize the gravity of the situation and the importance of teamwork. The turbulence began to subside, and Sophie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She glanced at Jack, who avoided her gaze, but seemed more focused on the task at hand. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start. As the plane leveled out, Sophie took a moment to assess the situation. The engine warning light had stopped flashing, but she knew they weren't out of the woods yet. She radioed air traffic control to report the incident and requested a priority landing clearance at the nearest airport, just in case. "This is Captain Langston," she announced over the intercom, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "We've encountered some turbulence and a minor technical issue, but everything is under control. We're continuing to monitor the situation and will keep you updated. Thank you for your patience." In the cockpit, Jack finally broke the silence. "We handled that well," he said grudgingly. Sophie glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "We handled it because we worked together. That's what this job is about, Jack. Not ego, not opinions, just doing the job." Jack didn't respond, but Sophie saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Respect, perhaps, or at least acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her hope. As the flight continued, the tension in the cockpit eased slightly. Jack remained reserved, but he no longer resisted Sophie's authority. Sophie focused on her duties, determined to see the flight through safely. But deep down, she knew the day wasn't over yet. Karma had a way of catching up with people, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. Karma's descent. The plane cruised through calmer skies as Captain Sophie Langston glanced at the altimeter, verifying the altitude adjustments they had made during the turbulence. The worst seemed to be behind them, but Sophie knew better than to let her guard down. The aviation world had taught her one unshakable lesson. Unpredictability was always a passenger. First Officer Jack Mitchell sat beside her, his usual rigidity softened by the earlier emergency. Although he had reluctantly cooperated, Sophie could sense his internal struggle. It wasn't remorse, at least not yet, but the realization that his biases could have had catastrophic consequences had he refused to act. Karma's descent. The plane cruised through calmer skies as Captain Sophie Langston glanced at the altimeter, verifying the altitude adjustments they had made during the turbulence. The worst seemed to be behind them, but Sophie knew better than to let her guard down. The aviation world had taught her one unshakable lesson. Unpredictability was always a passenger. First Officer Jack Mitchell sat beside her, his usual rigidity softened by the earlier emergency. Although he had reluctantly cooperated, Sophie could sense his internal struggle. It wasn't remorse, at least not yet, but the realization that his biases could have had catastrophic consequences had he refused to act. The intercom crackled, breaking the silence. Captain Langston, this is lead flight attendant Mia. A passenger in row 17 is experiencing severe chest pain. We've called for any medical professionals on board, but we may need to consider an emergency landing. Sophie's stomach tightened. A medical emergency at cruising altitude was every captain's nightmare. She pressed the intercom button. Thank you, Mia. Keep me updated on the passenger's condition. I'll contact air traffic control to coordinate. She turned to Jack, who was already reviewing the flight manual. Jack, I need you to calculate the nearest alternate airport. Prioritize the one with adequate medical facilities. Jack nodded, his earlier hostility now replaced by a sharp, focused professionalism. It was the first time she'd seen him work without hesitation. Sophie quickly radioed air traffic control, explaining the situation and requesting a diversion. This is Flight 227, requesting emergency landing clearance at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. We have a passenger experiencing severe medical distress and need immediate assistance upon landing. The response was swift. Flight 227, you are cleared for a priority approach to Dallas-Fort Worth. Adjust your heading to 215 degrees and descend to 24,000 feet. Emergency services will be on standby. Sophie repeated the instructions and began the descent. She could feel the weight of responsibility pressing harder now. Every decision she made carried the lives of her passengers. She glanced at Jack. I need you to assist with the descent checklist and prepare for a potential quick landing. This will be tight. Jack nodded, his voice steadier than before. Understood. In the cabin, the atmosphere was tense. Passengers whispered anxiously, the earlier turbulence still fresh in their minds. Mia, the lead flight attendant, knelt beside the passenger in distress, a middle-aged man clutching his chest, his face pale and sweaty. A doctor on board had responded to the call, doing their best to stabilize him with the limited resources available. We need to land as soon as possible, the doctor told Mia. I don't think he can last much longer. Mia nodded and relayed the message to Sophie. Captain, the doctor says it's critical. The passenger's condition is deteriorating rapidly. Sophie's hands tightened on the controls. Copy that. Mia, inform the passengers we're making an emergency landing and to remain seated with their seatbelts fastened. I'll get us there as quickly and safely as possible. She switched the intercom to address the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Langston. We have a medical emergency on board and will be making an emergency landing at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Please remain calm and follow the instructions of the flight attendants. Your safety is our top priority. As the plane descended, the weather began to shift. Dark clouds loomed ahead, and the radar lit up with signs of a developing storm. Sophie frowned, scanning the instruments. We've got weather building over Dallas, she said to Jack. This might complicate the landing. Jack looked at the radar, and cursed under his breath. It's going to be rough. Winds are picking up too. Sophie nodded, her mind racing. She had landed in difficult conditions before, but this was different. The stakes were higher, and she didn't have the luxury of waiting out the storm. The passenger's life depended on them landing as soon as possible. "We'll need to adjust our approach," she said. "Jack, configure for a turbulent landing and monitor the wind speeds. I'll handle the controls." Jack hesitated, then nodded. "I'll take care of it." For the first time, Sophie detected a shift in his tone, a hint of respect. He was finally recognizing her authority, albeit under extreme circumstances. The plane shook as it entered the storm, the turbulence more intense than before. Sophie's hands remained steady on the yoke, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the runway. The control tower guided them through the storm, their voices calm but urgent. "Flight 227, winds are at 25 knots with gusts up to 40. Visibility is limited. Expect crosswinds on final approach." Sophie repeated the instructions and prepared for the challenging landing. She glanced at Jack. "Double-check the landing gear and flaps. Make sure everything is ready." Jack complied, his hands moving swiftly over the controls. "Gear is down. Flaps are set." Sophie nodded, her focus unwavering. The plane rocked violently as they descended, the storm battering them from all sides. She could hear the passengers gasping in the cabin, their fear palpable. But Sophie's voice remained calm as she called out instructions to the crew. "Brace positions, everyone. This is going to be a bumpy landing." The runway finally came into view, a faint strip of light cutting through the darkness. Sophie aligned the plane with precision, adjusting for the crosswinds as they descended. Her heart pounded, but her training took over, guiding her every move. "Almost there," she muttered, more to herself than to Jack. The plane hit the runway hard, bouncing once before settling onto the tarmac. Sophie applied the brakes carefully, keeping the aircraft steady despite the gusting winds. When they finally came to a stop, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed safely at Dallas-Fort Worth," she announced over the intercom. "Please remain seated as emergency personnel board the aircraft." As the paramedics rushed on board to assist the passenger, Sophie remained in the cockpit, her hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Jack sat silently beside her, his usual bravado replaced by quiet contemplation. Finally, he broke the silence. "That was impressive." Sophie turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Thank you. But this is what I'm trained to do. We all are." Jack nodded, his gaze dropping to the controls. I didn't realize how much this job takes. I let my personal issues cloud my judgment. I could have jeopardized everything." Sophie studied him for a moment, then spoke softly. "It's not about being perfect, Jack. It's about putting the mission first. You're a good pilot, but being part of a team means setting aside biases and working together, no matter what." Jack nodded again, his shoulders slumping. "You're right. I'm sorry." Sophie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned back to the controls, preparing the plane for its next steps. But deep down, she felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps Jack's transformation wasn't complete, but the seeds of change had been planted. And for now, that was enough. Lessons in the storm. The passengers were safely disembarked, and paramedics whisked the ill passenger off the plane. Captain Sophie Langston remained in the cockpit, double-checking post-landing procedures. The storm outside continued to rage, rain pelting the aircraft as lightning streaked across the sky. The tense hum of the engines winding down was the only sound in the cockpit. Jack Mitchell sat silently in the co-pilot's seat, his earlier apology hanging in the air. He had finally acknowledged his mistake, but Sophie wasn't sure if it was genuine remorse or just the shock of narrowly avoiding disaster. She chose not to press him. Actions would speak louder than words. The radio crackled, and the ground crew's voice came through. "Captain Langston, weather conditions are worsening. Departure for connecting flights is delayed until further notice. We'll update you as soon as it's safe to taxi to the gate." "Understood," Sophie replied, her voice steady. She glanced at Jack. "Looks like we'll be grounded for a bit." Jack nodded but said nothing, his gaze fixed on the rain streaking the cockpit windows. Sophie leaned back in her seat, allowing herself a rare moment of stillness. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but there was no room for vulnerability. Not yet. The storm provided an odd sort of intermission, a chance for reflection. Sophie thought back to her early days in aviation, the countless hurdles she had faced as a woman in a male-dominated field. From subtle dismissals to outright hostility, she had seen it all, but she had refused to let it break her. Every obstacle had been a stepping stone to the captain's chair she now occupied. Jack, on the other hand, seemed to be grappling with an entirely different storm. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his body language betraying his inner turmoil. Finally, he spoke. "I underestimated you," he said, his voice low. "I've been flying for years, and I've never seen someone handle a landing like that." Sophie turned to him, her expression calm but firm. "Jack, this isn't about me proving anything to you. It's about doing our jobs, together. The passengers trust us with their lives. That trust has to be earned every single day." Jack nodded slowly, his brow furrowed. "You're right. I let my biases get in the way. I thought I knew better, but I was wrong. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry." Sophie studied him for a moment, searching for sincerity. She saw something in his eyes. Humility, perhaps, or at least a willingness to learn. "Apologies are a start," she said. "But change takes more than words." Jack seemed to absorb her words, nodding again. "Understood." The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. Sophie decided to check on the crew and passengers, ensuring everyone was as comfortable as possible while they waited. She stood and stretched, her muscles stiff from the tension of the flight. "I'll be back," she said to Jack. "Take over post-flight checks." Jack gave a curt nod. "Got it." Sophie stepped into the cabin, where the flight attendants were busy distributing water and snacks to the remaining passengers. Lead flight attendant Mia approached her, her expression one of quiet admiration. "Captain Langston, I just wanted to say, you were incredible out there. The passengers have been asking about you. They're calling you a hero." Sophie smiled faintly. "Just doing my job, Mia. But thank you. How's everyone holding up?" Mia gestured toward the cabin. "A little shaken, but they're managing. The passenger who was taken off, he's stable, according to the paramedics. They said your quick decision probably saved his life." The words filled Sophie with a quiet pride, but she didn't dwell on them. "Good to hear. Let me know if you need anything." Mia nodded, and Sophie made her way through the cabin, checking on passengers and offering reassurances. Many of them smiled at her, gratitude evident in their eyes. One older woman reached out to touch her arm as she passed. "Thank you, Captain," the woman said. "You kept us safe. We'll never forget that." Sophie nodded, her voice gentle. "Thank you for your trust." Back in the cockpit, Jack was finishing the post-flight checks. Sophie returned to her seat, the weight of the day settling on her shoulders. The storm outside had dimmed the natural light, casting the cockpit in an eerie glow. "You handled yourself well back there," Jack said, breaking the silence. "With the passengers, I mean. I don't think I've ever seen a captain take the time to check on them like that." Sophie glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "It's part of the job, Jack. Being a captain isn't just about flying the plane. It's about leading the crew, reassuring the passengers, and making decisions under pressure. It's a lot to balance, but it's what I signed up for." Jack leaned back in his seat, his gaze distant. "I guess I never thought about it like that. I've always focused on the technical side of things. Flying, navigation, systems. But you make it look seamless." "It's not seamless," Sophie admitted. "It's hard work. And sometimes it feels like walking a tightrope. But at the end of the day, it's worth it." Knowing that I've done everything I can to keep everyone safe, it's what keeps me going. Jack nodded slowly, his expression pensive. I think I've been so caught up in my own way of thinking that I forgot what this job is really about. Sophie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them, the storm outside their only witness. Finally, she spoke. Change isn't easy, Jack, but it's necessary. If you're willing to learn, there's hope for you yet. Jack met her gaze, a flicker of determination in his eyes. I want to do better, he said simply. The storm began to subside, the rain tapering off into a light drizzle. Sophie received word from the ground crew that the runway was clear, and they could taxi to the gate. She relayed the instructions to Jack, who worked efficiently to prepare the aircraft. As they moved toward the gate, Sophie felt a strange sense of closure. The flight had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but it had also reaffirmed her resilience. And perhaps it had sparked a change in Jack, however small. When they finally came to a stop, Sophie turned to Jack. You're a good pilot, Jack, but being a great one means letting go of ego and embracing the team. Think about that. Jack nodded, his expression serious. I will. As the passengers disembarked, Sophie stood at the cockpit door, thanking them individually. Their smiles and words of gratitude were a reminder of why she loved her job, despite its challenges. By the time the last passenger left, Sophie felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had weathered the storm, both literal and metaphorical, and emerged stronger. And though the skies might bring more challenges in the future, she knew she was ready. A different kind of flight. As the plane emptied and the storm cleared, Captain Sophie Langston leaned back in her seat, exhaustion finally catching up to her. The adrenaline that had kept her sharp through the turbulence, the emergency landing, and a confrontation with her first officer was now fading, leaving her drained but resolute. The lessons of this flight were not lost on her, nor, it seemed, on Jack Mitchell. Jack sat quietly in the co-pilot's seat, reviewing the logbook with unusual focus. His earlier defiance seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a reflective seriousness. Sophie had seen transformations like this before, moments where arrogance gave way to humility in the face of undeniable reality. But she knew better than to assume the battle was won. Change was a journey, not an instant. Captain Langston, Jack said hesitantly, breaking the silence. Do you have a moment? Sophie glanced at him, surprised by the formality in his tone. Of course, she replied, setting her pen down. What's on your mind? Jack exhaled deeply, as if steeling himself. I've been thinking about everything that's happened today, about how I acted, how I've been acting, and I realize I've let my own biases cloud my judgment, not just today, but for a long time. Sophie didn't interrupt, letting him find his words. I grew up in a family where tradition meant everything, Jack continued. My father was a pilot, and his father before him. They believed in the old ways, that certain roles were meant for certain people. I guess I never questioned it because, well, it was all I knew. Until today. He looked at her, his eyes earnest. When I saw how you handled that landing, how you stayed calm under pressure, I realized how wrong I've been. You're not just a good captain. You're a great one. And I'm sorry for not seeing that sooner. Sophie studied him carefully. His words seemed sincere, but she knew words alone weren't enough. Still, she appreciated his acknowledgement. Thank you, Jack, she said, her voice measured. Acknowledging the problem is the first step. The next step is action. Jack nodded. I understand, and I want to do better. I know it'll take time, but I'm ready to learn. As they completed the final checks and prepared to leave the aircraft, Sophie received a call on her airline-issued phone. It was from Martin Hayes, the airline's director of operations. His deep voice carried a mix of urgency and authority. Captain Langston, I've just been briefed on your flight. Outstanding work handling the emergency landing, Hayes said. You've upheld the highest standards of professionalism under extraordinary circumstances. Thank you, Mr. Hayes, Sophie replied. I was just doing my job. Still, Hayes continued, I'd like to debrief with you and your first officer tomorrow. There are some operational matters to discuss, and I'd like your input. Sophie agreed, noting the time and place of the meeting. When she ended the call, she turned to Jack. Looks like we'll be meeting with the director tomorrow. Be prepared to discuss today's flight. Jack nodded, his expression determined. I will. Later that evening, Sophie found herself at a quiet corner table in the airport lounge. The low hum of conversation and the clink of glasses created a soothing backdrop as she sipped her tea, reflecting on the day's events. The lounge was nearly empty, save for a few weary travelers and airline staff. Sophie relished the quiet moments like these, when she could process everything without distractions. Her thoughts were interrupted by Jack, who approached her cautiously. He carried a cup of coffee and looked almost uncertain, as if he wasn't sure he was welcome. May I join you? He asked. Sophie gestured to the chair across from her. Of course. Jack sat down, his movements deliberate. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Jack broke the silence. I've been reading up on leadership, he said, holding up his phone. Articles, case studies, that sort of thing. It's not something I've ever focused on before, but after today, I realized how much I need to understand it. Sophie raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Leadership isn't just about reading, Jack. It's about practicing what you've learned. I know, Jack admitted, but I need to start somewhere. And I want to start by asking you something. How do you stay so calm? Even when everything was falling apart, you didn't lose your cool. How do you do it? Sophie considered his question carefully. It's not about never feeling fear or doubt, she said finally. It's about focusing on what needs to be done and trusting your training. When you've put in the work and prepared for every scenario, you learn to trust yourself and your team. Jack nodded, absorbing her words. I've always thought of myself as a good pilot, but today I realized how much I still have to learn. Not just about flying, but about working with people. Sophie gave him a small smile. The fact that you're willing to learn is a step in the right direction. The next morning, Sophie and Jack met with Martin Hayes in a sleek conference room at the airline's headquarters. Hayes was a seasoned pilot turned executive, with a reputation for being both fair and demanding. He listened intently as Sophie recounted the events of the flight, nodding occasionally but saying little. When she finished, Hayes turned to Jack. First Officer Mitchell, what's your take on what happened? Jack straightened in his chair, his expression serious. I think the flight exposed some weaknesses, mostly in me. I let my personal biases affect my professionalism, and that's unacceptable. Captain Langston handled the situation with skill and leadership, and I need to learn from her example. Hayes raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. That's an honest assessment, Mitchell. And I expect you to follow through on what you've said. This airline prides itself on teamwork and professionalism. There's no room for anything less. Jack nodded. I understand, sir. Hayes turned back to Sophie. Captain Langston, I've always been impressed with your record, but this flight proves why you're one of our best. We'll be incorporating your feedback into our training programs to ensure every pilot understands the importance of teamwork and respect. Thank you, Mr. Hayes, Sophie said. I'm happy to contribute. As they left the meeting, Jack walked alongside Sophie, his steps more confident than before. Thank you for giving me a chance to make things right, he said. Sophie looked at him, her expression thoughtful. This isn't about me, Jack. It's about the passengers, the crew, and the responsibility we carry every time we step into the cockpit. Remember that. Jack nodded, a faint smile on his face. I won't forget. As they parted ways, Sophie felt a sense of closure. The flight had tested her in ways she hadn't expected, but it had also reaffirmed her belief in resilience, professionalism, and the power of change. And as she prepared for her next flight, she knew she would carry these lessons with her, no matter what challenges the skies might bring. New Horizons. Captain Sophie Langston stood on the tarmac of Clearwater International Airport, the morning sun casting long shadows over the sleek fuselage of the aircraft she would soon command. The events of the previous flight still lingered in her mind, but not as a burden, rather as a reminder of the resilience and strength she had cultivated over years of navigating both the skies and the prejudices that often followed her. Today was a new day, and the horizon stretched before her, filled with possibilities. Inside the terminal, passengers bustled through security and gathered at the gate. The crew, a blend of familiar and new faces, assembled for the pre-flight briefing. Among them was Jack Mitchell, the first officer who had challenged her leadership not long ago. But something about him was different. His stance was more relaxed, his expression open, and his eyes carried a glint of determination that Sophie hadn't seen before. "Morning, everyone," Sophie greeted, her voice calm and commanding. "Let's make this a smooth flight. Jack, care to walk us through the weather conditions?" Jack stepped forward, holding a tablet loaded with meteorological data. His voice was steady as he explained the forecast, pointing out potential areas of turbulence and their contingency plans. Sophie watched him closely, noting the subtle shift in his demeanor. He wasn't just doing his job. He was engaging with the team, contributing to the collective effort. As the briefing concluded, Sophie addressed the group. "Thank you, everyone. Let's stay sharp and work together. Safety is always our top priority." The crew dispersed, heading toward the aircraft. Jack lingered, walking alongside Sophie as they made their way to the gate. "Thanks for letting me lead that segment," he said, his tone genuine. Sophie glanced at him. "It's part of your role as first officer, and it's good to see you stepping up." Jack nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been doing a lot of reflecting since our last flight. I realized that leadership isn't just about technical skills. It's about setting the right example and building trust." Sophie smiled faintly. "You're learning, Jack. Keep at it." Once on board, Sophie and Jack settled into the cockpit. The pre-flight checks proceeded smoothly, with Jack actively participating and double-checking the systems. His newfound focus was a stark contrast to his earlier defiance. Sophie appreciated the change but remained cautious. True growth required time and consistency. As passengers boarded, Sophie reviewed the flight plan one last time. The route would take them over several weather systems, but nothing too severe. She felt confident in their preparations. "Ready for pushback," Sophie announced to the ground crew. The engines roared to life as the aircraft began its taxi to the runway. Sophie's voice came over the intercom, calm and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Langston. Welcome aboard Flight 872 with service to Denver. Our expected flight time is just under 3 hours. We're anticipating a smooth ride, but please keep your seatbelts fastened whenever you're seated. Thank you for flying with us." Jack turned to her after the announcement. "You have a way of putting people at ease," he said. "It's a skill I didn't realize I needed to develop." "It's about connection," Sophie replied. "Passengers trust us with their lives. The least we can do is let them know they're in good hands." Jack nodded, his respect for Sophie evident. As the plane climbed to cruising altitude, the familiar rhythm of flight settled in. The cabin crew began their service, and Sophie monitored the instruments with practiced ease. Jack took the opportunity to ask a question that had clearly been on his mind. "Can I ask how you got into flying?" he said. "You make it look so natural, but I'm sure it wasn't easy." Sophie smiled, her gaze focused on the horizon. "It wasn't. My father was an aviation mechanic, and I spent a lot of time around planes growing up. I fell in love with the idea of flying, but there weren't many women in the field back then. I had to work twice as hard to prove myself. And even then, there were people who doubted me." Jack winced. "I was one of them." Sophie shook her head. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last. The important thing is what you do moving forward." Jack absorbed her words, his expression pensive. "I want to be better, not just as a pilot, but as a person. Seeing how you handled everything on our last flight, it changed the way I think about leadership. Sophie glanced at him, her voice soft but firm. Leadership isn't about perfection. It's about integrity and resilience. You'll make mistakes, but what matters is how you respond to them. Jack nodded, determination etched on his face. I'll remember that. Midway through the flight, the weather took an unexpected turn. A pocket of turbulence jolted the plane, causing a ripple of unease among the passengers. Sophie quickly adjusted the altitude, her hand steady on the controls. Jack, monitor the radar, she said. Let's see if we can find a smoother path. Jack complied, his movements swift and efficient. Looks like we can avoid the worst of it by heading slightly west. I'll adjust the course. Sophie nodded, watching as he input the changes. His calm demeanor was a far cry from the defiance she had encountered earlier. Together, they navigated the turbulence, ensuring the passengers felt as little discomfort as possible. Once the ride smoothed out, Sophie turned to Jack. Good work. That's the kind of teamwork we need. Jack gave her a small, appreciative smile. Thanks, Captain. I'm starting to see what you mean about trust and collaboration. The rest of the flight proceeded without incident, and the plane began its descent into Denver. Sophie guided the aircraft with precision, her hands steady on the controls. Jack monitored the systems, calling out the altitudes and speeds with practiced ease. Flaps set, Jack reported as they approached the runway. Landing gear down, Sophie confirmed. The plane touched down smoothly, eliciting a round of applause from the passengers. Sophie allowed herself a small smile as she brought the aircraft to a stop on the taxiway. Welcome to Denver, ladies and gentlemen, she announced. The local time is 3:15 p.m., and the weather is sunny with a comfortable temperature of 68 degrees. Thank you for flying with us, and we hope to see you again soon. As they taxied to the gate, Jack turned to Sophie. You make it look easy. It's not about being easy, Sophie replied. It's about being prepared. Jack nodded, his respect for her evident. Thanks for giving me the chance to learn from you. I'll do my best to carry these lessons forward. Sophie regarded him thoughtfully. You've come a long way, Jack. Keep pushing yourself, and you'll go even further. As the passengers disembarked, Sophie and Jack stood by the cockpit door, thanking each person as they passed. The smiles and words of gratitude from the passengers were a reminder of why they both had chosen this career. It wasn't just about flying planes, it was about connecting with people, ensuring their safety, and earning their trust. When the last passenger had left, Jack turned to Sophie. This flight felt different. Better. Thanks to you. Sophie smiled, her voice steady. It felt different because you let it. You chose to be part of the solution. As they exited the plane together, Sophie looked out at the Denver skyline. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. For Jack, it was the beginning of a new chapter. For Sophie, it was a reminder that leadership wasn't about commanding. It was about inspiring others to rise to their potential. And as they walked toward the terminal, Sophie knew that the skies ahead, though unpredictable, held endless possibilities.